Today, I'd like to welcome Professor Emeritus Demetrios Michaelides from the University of Cyprus. Dr. Michaelides has worn many different hats over the years, including as Assistant Director at the British School at Rome and as Archaeological Officer at the Cyprus Department of Antiquities and President of the International Committee for the Conservation of Mosaics.
After 18 years of being president, I am now President Emeritus.
Okay. And his research interests include Hellenistic and Roman mosaics, trade in the Greco-Roman world, in addition to the topography of Hellenistic and Roman Cyprus, to name but a few. And today, however, we'll be discussing ancient medicine and medicinal practices in Cyprus. Dr. Michaelides, welcome to the podcast, and thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me.
My first question, I suppose, is discussing what we know about the typical Cypriot who lived, say, 2,500 years ago. What was life expectancy like for them at the time, and what were the typical ailments they would have been exposed to?
Yeah, well, before trying to answer that, I should specify to those listening that I am not a doctor. I'm an archaeologist, so I look at things from a different viewpoint than doctors do. But certainly, life expectancy was much, much shorter than what we have today. I'm only guessing now, but certainly a 50, 55-year-old person would be considered really old.
Mm-hmm.
People matured faster and died faster than we do nowadays. And of course, in antiquity, they had to deal with many illnesses which are now easily treatable, but not so in antiquity. So a lot of people died of very simple things simply because they could not be treated. But all the same, medicine was highly developed in antiquity. In late classical times, Hellenistic and Roman times, medicine really reached levels which were not surpassed till centuries later. But you remember, they did not have antibiotics. They didn't know about microorganisms as we know today. They had no microscopes. And at least in most places, vivisection or even dissection of humans was forbidden. So they had a lot of constraints. But I repeat, it is amazing what they could do.
Yeah, and I think we're gonna see that with where our discussion goes. Now, still talking about Cypriots 2,000 years ago, and if we think about Cypriots today, I know that we're prone to thalassemia, as are many Mediterranean peoples. I understand you're not a medical doctor, but perhaps you can shed some light on this. I vaguely recall that thalassemia is an evolutionary disease, evolutionary response that provides varying degrees of resistance to malaria. Now, is that something that the ancient Cypriots had to deal with?
Yes. As you probably know, well, I'm sure you know, thalassemia has been a very big problem in Cyprus till modern times. It is now controlled. And for example, if a young couple wants to get married, to get the marriage certificate, to get the marriage permit from the church, if they want to marry in church, they have to show that they have been tested for thalassemia. Even when the results might show that the possible offspring, the offspring might possibly be having a bad case of thalassemia, because there are, of course, many degrees. The church cannot stop the couple from getting married. They will advise them.
Right.
that it would be better not to have children. And, most people have been very careful. So now thalassemia is controlled. But in the past, it was absolutely terrible. And my father, late father, who was a doctor, I mean, I remember from my childhood a lot of young children suffering from thalassemia that he was treating.
Now, is this because malaria was a big problem in Cyprus since antiquity? I mean, I remember reading some primary sources from the British handover, or rather, when the Ottoman Empire handed over Cyprus to Great Britain in the late 1800s. There was a lot of reports about marshes and mosquitoes and rampant malaria, something that you don't really think about. I don't think about marshes when I think of Cyprus. But it was well documented then, and I suspect that was a problem going back to antiquity. Is that the case?
Yes, when the British came to Cyprus in the late 19th century, the country was really infested with mosquitoes. And they had great schemes for facing this problem and solving it to a very large extent. And one of the things they did was to dry up the marshes,
Hmm.
stagnant water, and they imported eucalyptus trees from Australia, which just drank up all the water uh, and dried up the marshes. That was one of several measures. But malaria was still very much around till the interwar period in the 20th century. Of course, it isn't anymore.
Right.
And in antiquity, uh, we assume, we know it was there. Sorry, before going to antiquity, we have um, travelers in the Renaissance in particular, and even later, which speak of the foul weather and imply that, if you didn't get away very quickly, you would get ill.
Hmm.
So they were aware that something was going wrong. And in antiquity, one thing we can tell from the human remains is that a lot of people suffered from some form of hemolytic anemia, which is associated with thalassemia.
Hmm.
And you can tell this from several telltale signs, especially on the skull. The sufferers from hemolytic anemias have what is called cripra orbidalia, which are a set of little holes in the orbit of the eye, or the eye socket on the skeleton, which is created by these anemias. And also the skull itself has hyperostosis. It becomes thicker, especially at the top, in an effort of the body to produce more red corpuscles. So these are things that you can see on the skeletons.
Yeah, and I like that you brought that up because I think in one of your papers you mentioned that other common diseases that you can see from the skeletons was Pott's disease, which is a disease I believe that affects the spine, ear infections. Well, now that technology has improved, and I mean we have access to DNA technologies in particular. Has that changed the way archaeologists interact with finds, talking human remains? Do we know of any other ailments, or has that pretty much stayed the same with the finds that have been made in the past and the finds that are made in the present?
No, it has changed a lot, and it's changing fast. Uh, and say some of my ex-students have specialized in paleopathology, and they are working on skeletons that I excavated in Paphos, looking for things that I would never know you could find from a skeleton. but they can tell a lot now about diet, much more. I mean, that you could tell before, but now they can tell a lot more about that. Nutrition in particular, yes, not diet, nutrition, but also other factors that affected the spine, the skeleton, sorry, environmental factors that affected that.
Well, I mean, but you have been quite involved. I know that in 1984, one of your first published papers was on findings in a Roman doctor's tomb in Paphos. Just reading about that was incredible because you found a lot of his tools that were buried with him, and some of these you wouldn't have imagined that they would be using. I'll give you an example. One of the items was a syringe, and I don't think of doctors 2,000 years ago using syringes, and obviously the syringes are for a different purpose. But again, like you said, very technologically advanced. So my question to you is, what was the typical toolkit that doctors in the Greco-Roman world, but more focused on Cyprus, what sort of tools would they have been using?
Well, the tomb you refer to in Paphos was a turning point in my research career. You might be interested to know that I was brought up to be a doctor because my father is a doctor, my brother is a doctor, and so on. But I moved away from it very quickly. But the first major discovery I made when I returned to work in Cyprus was the tomb you referred to. And at the time, I didn't know much about ancient surgical instruments. But when I showed the instruments to my father, he could tell me the use of each one of them, which shows you that very little has changed for the basic surgical instruments since antiquity. Of course, they did not have steel. They did have steel, sorry, but they didn't have the means of making what people make today. And of course, they didn't have laser to use for surgery and things. But all the instruments that were found in the tomb in Paphos are easily recognizable. The rarest is the one you mentioned, which is a syringe. It's a big syringe. It couldn't be used like we use a syringe today for injections. It's thick. The spout is thick, but it fits exactly the description of a piulkos, which, as the name implies, it's an instrument for removing pus from infected wounds and ears and things like that, which is described in detail by Hero of Alexandria. And it is one of only a really handful of such instruments that are known to have survived from the ancient world. So that is a rare instrument. The others are, well, scalpels, of course, are common. Scalpels that have a sharp end and a blunt end. So the sharp end, of course, is for cutting. Blunt end is for a multiple of uses, even lifting blood vessels during operations. And well, the other common instrument is a set of bone levers of different sizes. These are instruments for lifting broken bones and pushing them or easing them back into position. And so we have a set of instruments of such bone levers because the size depended on the bone being treated. You used small levers for small bones, big levers for big ones.
Now you mentioned actually you in your findings there were also a set or a number of cylindrical bronze tubes that presumably contained some ointments.
there were, or if I remember right, there were 6 or 7 tubular containers.
Hmm.
One of them contained 6 delicate instruments, surgical instruments. They were kept in there for protection so that they wouldn't
Okay.
break
Yeah.
because they were delicate. But the others, 2 of them had not been perforated through corrosion. The others had holes on them and we lost their content.
Hmm.
But those that still preserve their content had one had powder, a red powder, and the other one had little pill-like pellets.
Huh.
They have been analyzed, and they are byproducts of copper in both cases. In the case of the pills, I am now, this was done a long time ago, and we only looked for minerals at the time. For the pills, I'm now trying to have them analyzed again, but also looking for organic material because I think they may have some plant extract with them.
Now, these pills, are we to assume that they would have been ingested, much like we would take prescription medicine today?
I would think so, yes.
Oh, wow, that's incredible. Pill
I'm
form.
guessing, but
Yeah.
that's what I think.
Well, it's amazing because I believe Galen, the personal physician of Marcus Aurelius, visited Cyprus, as
Yeah.
did Dioscorides or Dioscorides, chief physician to Nero. And it makes you wonder what would bring someone halfway across the Mediterranean to Cyprus? What did Cyprus have to offer? Why would ancient doctors make this type of trip to this island in the Eastern Mediterranean?
Well, Cyprus has been known since a remote antiquity for its copper. And by the time of Galen in the 2nd, 3rd century AD, the use of minerals coming from copper were very well known in the Roman world. And with that, Cyprus was associated. They knew that Cyprus had all these wonderful copper deposits and minerals that had been used for centuries for treating people. It was also known that Cyprus has very rich vegetation. You wouldn't think so if you came here in the summer when everything is dry, but after spring,
Yeah,
everything grows.
yeah.
And so the medicaments made from uh, the vegetation of Cyprus were also well known in antiquity. So Galen came, and he mentions this specifically in his writings. He came on purpose to Cyprus to visit the mines and get substances that he knew the medicinal properties of, but also to experiment that with others that he didn't know. So it was, it was a planned visit
Hmm.
specifically for the minerals of Cyprus. And we know that, for example, he took misy with him, which is one of these byproducts of copper, which is chalcopyrite. I don't know if that's a correct pronunciation in English. Sulfide of copper and iron.
Hmm.
And he tells us in his writings that when leaving Cyprus, he took with him enough quantities of misy to last him for 30 years of his practice in Rome. So that must have been an enormous quantity he took with him of just misy. He took other substances
Right.
too.
My mom, I was talking to my mother about this because you mentioned the rock rose. I think the scientific term would be labdanum, but my mom knows it as xistarka. Uh,
Xistarca, yes.
yeah. Now she wasn't. I mentioned it to her, but she wasn't familiar with its medicinal properties. She told me that the goats, when they would graze, they would have this substance stick to them, And I said, well, apparently the Cypriots, they used it for medicinal reasons. Now, is that, and I'm always looking for continuities between the past and the present. Are there any continuities between what the ancient Cypriots did with medicine and what we do, or what my mother's generation would have done?
There are continuities. We still use a lot of herbs for mild treatments, not heavy
Yeah.
uh, ones, but we still use them a lot. But even the name Xistarka, which is the Cypriot dialect for the rock rose,
Yeah.
xizo in Greek means to scrape.
Hmm.
And the reason it got its name is because in antiquity, and this is described by several ancient authors, especially the Dioscorides, they would let the goats graze among these bushes, and the oily substance from the leaves of the cistus plant would stick to their hair, to their fur and
Hmm.
beards, and then they would be combed, scraped to remove this oily substance. And that was used for just about everything in medicine in antiquity. It was a panacea,
Hmm.
not only by itself, but also mixed with other substances. And it was at the same time, and perhaps even more so in later times, used in perfumery. It is the basic ingredient that gives the amber scent to perfumes. And in fact, there is a whole set of perfumes nowadays, because it's still being used for that today, which include the name Chypre, Cyprus, in them, because Chypre is one of the 8 main families of perfumes. Perfumes are divided into families. One of them
Right.
is
Yeah.
Chypre, and Chypre is associated with cistus, with labdanum from Cyprus.
Right.
Unfortunately, we don't produce it anymore.
Yeah.
It comes mostly from the Arab world today,
Hmm.
but it,
One of the other finds in the doctor's tomb was, I believe, a bleeding cup. I know, obviously, ancient Greek medicine relied on the balancing the four humors, and one of them was blood. Presumably, this cup would have been used to take out blood in someone who was ill. Would they have used it for cupping as well? My mother, who's one of my resources when I'm when I'm looking into continuity between the past and the present, she mentioned as a child they would do gaja. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly.
yes,
Uh,
so
is that what they would have done as well in antiquity?
yes, they had dry cupping
Hmm.
and they had wet cupping. The dry one was kaja, like we do today, or some people do today. I, my mother used to cup me. I don't know if that's the verb, when I
Yeah,
was
yeah,
young, and I always enjoyed it and I miss it very much.
yeah,
Looking at the web, I realized that it is getting back into fashion, and there are photographs of Jennifer Aniston
yeah.
on the web with marks from dry cupping. Or bronchial problems, the common cold, all these things. The cupping is beneficial to these things, and it really is. It helps a lot. But wet cupping is different, of course, because
Yeah.
you incise the skin before you apply the cup on it to draw out blood. And that was to lower fever, very much like they used to use leeches for
Hmm.
getting blood out of the body. And we know the instrument from Paphos was used for wet cupping because it's not a uniform cup, let's say. It has a constriction the circumference of the mouth is smaller, and the mouth and the neck are smaller than the body itself. And the reason is that so that the blood would be trapped in the bigger body and not run out straight away. I don't know if I explained this properly. Think of a bottle, let's say, in a horizontal position. If you have some liquid in it, it will stay below the neck, so it wouldn't run out if you have the bottle in a horizontal position. So this cap would function more or less in this way.
Personally, I think one of the most intriguing finds that has come out of Cyprus, and I think they're unique to Cyprus, is the thermasmata. And I really want anyone listening to Google these. Can you explain to the listeners what those were?
A lot of what I'm going to say is guesswork,
Yeah.
but there is no other explanation for these strange, really strange
Yeah.
containers. They are unique, let's say, to Cyprus in the sense that we have a lot of them here, and they are all concentrated in Paphos, nowhere else in Cyprus so far. Outside Cyprus, there is one example in Rimini, in the house of the surgeon in Rimini, which must have come from the same workshop as the ones in Paphos. It's identical practically to them. There is another one from a shipwreck, and anything else that resembles them or might be used in the same way looks very different. So what we have in this Cypriot group are vessels made of very, very, very thin clay. I mean, very thin walls, clay vessels with very thin walls. They are made in two halves. Their lower half is molded on human parts of the body, on a hand, ear, shoulders, elbows, the thorax, knees, every part of the body, even male genitalia, and that's the lower part. On this is attached the upper part, which is made to look like the part of the body is going to treat. So if you want to treat the hand, you don't need to look for the piece with the molded shape of the hand, but you look at the hand. I mean, it looks exactly like a hand. So you take it and apply it directly onto the ailing part of the body.
Sort of like a buyota.
A bouillot, a hot water bottle, yes.
Right.
I should say, I didn't say that between the lower and the upper part, of course, there is a gap and there is a hole to fill it with. And we assume that they use something warm, a warm liquid. Oil retains its heat longer. So again, it's a guess, but very likely they would use oil. But these vessels are unknown in the ancient literature. Nobody mentions anything of the kind. We know of thermasmata, as you mentioned, which are basically like plasters today, but they were not made of clay. They were made of cloth with medicaments inside them, very much like modern plasters. So this is a very rare and so far characteristic of Paphos medical vessel. A whole group of them was found in the 60s in either a workshop where they were being made, or more likely in a doctor's atelier, but no further excavation was done at the time. So we just have this cache of hot water bottles. Since then, I have found quite a number in the excavations of the House of Orpheus, in Paphos again, including several new types. So now we have one which is for a female breast that we didn't have before. So we can cover the whole body practically, the human body.
That raises an interesting question. Most of these finds, it appears, are coming out of Paphos, so if I recall, Kition, Larnaca. Any particular reason why those two areas are where the majority of the finds are?
Well, Paphos was the Hellenistic and Roman capital, so it is logical to assume that medicine, the medical practice, was developed in the capital. And there has been another discovery in Paphos in the Agora excavations, which are being carried out by the Polish excavation in Paphos. They found more surgical instruments, not as many as in the tomb of the surgeon, but it is just another indication that medicine was a sophisticated science in Paphos in Roman times. Kition is, I think, different. And I think one of the reasons that we have Kition associated with medical practice is due to the swampy nature of the area. Now, of course, in Kition, which is modern Larnaca, we associate it with the salt lake because the coastline has changed. And what was an open harbor in antiquity and then later a swamp has now become a salt lake. So and salt, of course, is also an important substance used in medicine. So it's another reason. On one side, the unhealthy air of swamps, and also the availability of salt, especially in later times.
And if you've ever visited, and this is to the listeners here, if you've ever visited a museum that features Cypriot artifacts, you've probably noticed base ring ware vessels that were peculiarly shaped. And essentially, those vessels are inverted poppy bulbs. And I encourage anyone listening to Google that just to get a sense of what I'm talking about. Now, why was that a popular motif in Cyprus?
It's a very controversial point. They do look very much like upside down poppy, the capsule of the poppy. And some of them are also painted with little lines, or even are incised with little lines, which make them look even more like a poppy head being incised to extract the latex from it. So the shape and the appearance, and also the fact that this is a very common export of Bronze Age Cyprus in the Mediterranean, led originally Robert Michaelides, a colleague, Australian colleague, to interpret them as containers of opium for export. His interpretation has been followed by many, has been disputed by others. Analysis have been carried out, and traces of opium have been found in some of these vessels, but also in other vessels. But we must remember that the latex was used not in the way we use it today. I mean, abuse it today, rather.
Yeah, the recreational use of opium as opposed to the medicinal.
Exactly. And also, the poppy itself had a multitude of uses, not just for medicinal problems. So it is an open question, but it is so very likely that it was used for opium. Unfortunately, there is no mention by any ancient author associating Cyprus with opium production. But,
Which I
not
find really surprising because given its ubiquitousness across the island and poppies and their derivative opium, that it wasn't something that was mentioned in the Hellenistic age. You would assume that they would have been quite familiar with it and presumably would have administered it in surgical operations. But that wasn't the case, if I'm to understand correctly.
Well, we don't know because nobody mentions them. There is one reference by a Cypriot doctor. This is Diagoras, the Cypriot, who lived in the 3rd, 2nd century before Christ, who was famous for a collyrion, for an eye preparation, which is made from all sorts of exotic things, including opium. So, and this is a Cypriot doctor, so we can associate it with opium and Cyprus. But of course, going to answering what you said, what in Cypriot dialect we call haskashi, which is a variety of the Papaver soniferum, or another type we have in Cyprus. The haskasha in Cypriot, to say somebody's haskasmenos, it means somebody's a bit gaga, has lost it.
Yeah.
And this is, of course, associated with, it derives from haskashi, and haskashi, as I said, is the opium poppy. When I was working in Paphos with some very old ladies, work ladies, not workmen, work women, and they were sort of reminiscing of their younger days and the tough life they had, harvesting in the high heat of summer in Cyprus, or olive picking, etc. And I said to them, what did you do with your children when you are so busy working from sunrise to sunset? And they said, oh, we just gave them haskashi, tea. They made tea with the seeds of this and gave them to the children, which slept under the olive tree.
Wow.
Till the mothers were free to look after them again. So it was used until fairly recently in living memory.
I think I have to ask my mother about that.
In a very different way.
Yeah.
Can go from what it is used.
Yeah,
today,
absolutely.
In some areas anyway. Yeah.
I'm glad you brought up that Cypriot doctor because I don't want listeners to think that Cyprus was only exploited for its resources. It actually produced its own doctors. And amazingly, we have in the literary record at least 19 who either were Cypriot or at the very least practiced in Cyprus, including the Cypriots Apollonion of Kition, Zeno the Cypriot. In fact, I think Zeno the Cypriot was famous for founding a school of medicine in Alexandria. So what other things were these Cypriot doctors known for? I think one of them may have even produced a treatise that is still around.
Well, Zeno that you mentioned was very famous. We don't have very much information on him, but he was famous. He had this school in Alexandria, which some of his graduates included some of the most famous doctors in antiquity. So it was a very important school of medicine. But the other important thing in relation to Zeno is that he quarreled, or well, he had disagreements with the bishop of Alexandria, and he was exiled. But then he was later reinstated, and the letters written to him after his return to Alexandria survive, or some of the letters survive, and they include letters from Julian, the Emperor Julian, the apostate, and the famous orator, sophist, Libanius, which extol his medical knowledge, calling him the doctor of the doctors. So it shows you how important he was to receive letters from Libanius and the Emperor Julian. But for Apollonios of Kition, we know a lot more because one of his treatises, as you mentioned, survives. We know that he was the author of many books, and one on epilepsy. They don't survive. The one that does survive is the one on joints, which is an early commentary on Hippocrates. And we know from his own introduction to the book that the writing of it was commissioned by Ptolemy, king of Cyprus. This, we are talking about the 1st century BC, and the book is dedicated to the king himself. And it includes 30 Hippocratic methods of dealing with fractures, bone fractures, and dislocations and how to treat them. And what is very important in relation to this is that he tells us in the introduction of the book that in order to avoid the inexperienced doctors or doctors that are too tired make a mistake during treatment, he illustrates the book with the methods. So this is one of the earliest recorded books, medical books, with illustrations. Of course, the original manuscript of Apollonius does not survive, but we have a complete copy of it, which was preserved in the library of Byzantine doctor Nikitas of the 8th century, which shows you that till the 8th century, this was still a very important book. And also, even much later, during the Renaissance, in the early 15th century, when Ennio Silvio Piccolomini, the future Pope Pius II, talks about Kition, he says, Kition, blah, 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 the city of Zeno, the founder of Stoic philosophy, and of Apollonios, the doctor. So until then, he was very well known.
You mentioned that, of course, there were limits to medicine, and when medicine couldn't correct the ailments, so to speak, gods were supplicated. And we have evidence of this a lot in what are called ex votos, I believe. Can you explain what those were and what were the common types that were found in temples around Cyprus?
Yes, these are ex votos. In the Hellenistic period, in the Archaic period, we have ex votos made of clay. They are small terracotta figurines, which represent parturition, preparation for it, the actual birth, the moment of birth. And this, we assume, acted as sort of a way of protecting the woman. Because, in antiquity and later, women very often died during parturition. This is one group. In a bit later, in Hellenistic times and Roman times, the ex votos changed completely. And what we have are small representations of the ailing part of the body: an eye, an ear, a breast, a phallus, any part of the body that was suffering. They would have it made in stone or in clay and put it up in a sanctuary, praying for its cure. Sometimes we assume that such ex votos were also put after the cure in order to thank the god for helping in the cure. After a prayer, you get cured. So you put an image of the part of your body that was cured into the temple to thank the god. And we know this from the continuation of this habit, of this tradition to this day, because we have ex votos, not made of stone or clay, but made of beeswax, used in exactly the same way today. People hang them around an icon, either in prayer for the cure of that part of the body, of their own body, or the body of a friend or family member, or they are put after the cure. And we know this after the cure because there is a sort of a well-known prayer. Let's say a parent is praying for the cure of a family member, and he says to the saint, if you cure him, I give you a candle the weight of his body or her body. And we have gigantic candles in churches, really unusable as a candle, which are obviously the equivalent of the cured person's body weight.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a tradition that really goes on since antiquity.
Yeah, which I find amazing. Anytime I can pick up on continuities between the past and the present, I'm really taken aback. And much like today, you mentioned church practices, although not condoned by the church. Evil eye amulets are something that are quite popular around the Levant. Not just Cyprus, but you can find them in Lebanon. You can find them in Turkey. But the ancient, and that of course is to ward off the evil eye. But the ancient Cypriots, they had other, for lack of a better word, amulets, such as, well, I mean, maybe you can talk to us about that. What were those, and how were they? I think you call it apotropaic, which is really, I love that word.
Yes.
How did those work, and what did they use to represent or to ward off evil?
Yeah, well, of course, the protagonist in all this is the evil eye, as you mentioned, the Vaskanos ophthalmos, which is very much alive today. People are scared of the evil eye, not only Cyprus, but
My wife is Italian, so I know about the malocchio.
Valocchio, exactly.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. And of course, in the Arab world, is there also. So it's not a sort of Western tradition. It's all the Mediterranean that has this malocchio. But there were amulets of general apotropaic nature, the representation of monsters on a piece of jewelry would avert evil. The representation of male genitalia, we'd find this very strange today, that somebody
Right.
would have a chain with male genitalia hanging
Right.
from it. But it was an apotropaic amulet to avert the evil spirits or eye. Another thing was a clenched fist, which again was used as an amulet in glass or other substances, again hanging on a chain. And the clenched fist is an indication of strength. So that would make the owner strong, the wearer strong to avert whatever evil was coming his or
Okay.
her way. And of course, you have other more specific amulets, which are sort of medicinal, perhaps one can call them. We have one amulet which has a magic formula written on it, which includes the word pepte, which is from pepsis, which means digestion. So it's an amulet for helping the wearer digest in
Right.
case of indigestion.
Which for our listeners is where the company Pepsi got their name for their for their cola.
Pepsi, yes.
Yeah. So, and you explained the clenched fist. That makes sense. Strength. Is there any guess as to why the phallus is that the same explanation? Strength, virility, and what other explanations can we have for that?
It's yes. I think the answer is yes to what you said, and we don't only have it in amulets. The phallus is used for many other things. The representation of the phallus is used for many other things, and it's always a sort of magic. Is sometimes represented together with weird animals,
Hmm.
uh, again to avert the evil spirits.
Well, this has been really incredible talk, and it was a pleasure to have you here. And thank you so much, because this really does provide a lot more insight into the history of Cyprus. And I just wanted to thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.